Hello, welcome to Unit 2 of our course. In this unit, we will be addressing the Cold War, the long period of struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union. This unit will begin on Sunday, November 2nd, and end on Saturday, November 8th at 11:59 p.m. During this unit, you will be asked to participate in a discussion board, complete a film commentary assignment, and answer questions related to a feature essay from your textbook. The Cold War emerged really out of the end of World War II. The Cold War began at the end of the war in 1945, and the Cold War would continue into the early 1990s until the Soviet Union finally collapsed and dissolved. During the Cold War, there were two great global powers, the United States and the Soviet Union. These two nations emerged as the dominant powers in the world out of World War II. They had been the two countries most directly involved in the victory. The United States and the Soviet Union worked together to defeat Nazi Germany, and to some extent worked together to defeat Imperial Japan as well during the war. After the war, the United States was clearly the dominant economic power in the world, and after the war, the United States and the Soviet Union were clearly the two most powerful militaries in the world. Tragically, but perhaps inevitably, tension emerged between the United States and the Soviet Union following World War II. Really, their alliance had always been rather strange. The United States and the Soviet Union had radically different political, economic, and ideological systems. They really had almost nothing in common. The United States had an economic system rooted in free market capitalism, while the Soviet Union embraced a command economy or communist economy where the government controlled the entire production and distribution of goods. The United States embraced the notion of liberal democracy, whereas the Soviet Union promoted dictatorship and totalitarianism, repressive forms of government. The two systems could not possibly be more different. And in fact, ever since the emergence of Soviet Russia or the Soviet Union in 1919-1920, the United States and the Soviets had a rather hostile relationship. The only reason that the two states were allied during World War II was the presence of a common enemy, principally Nazi Germany. This is the only reason the two countries worked together, essentially was that they had to cooperate in order to defeat the Germans. Once Nazi Germany was defeated, there really was no longer any basis for cooperation between the two great powers anymore. And not surprisingly, their relationship deteriorated rather quickly. The discussion board question for this week asks you to comment on the origins of the Cold War. How did the Cold War emerge? How did it come about? Why did the Cold War emerge? I think that this will be an interesting and thought-provoking question. There's a good deal of material in your textbook related to this topic, and I think you'll find it to be a stimulating discussion, and I look forward to participating in that discussion as well. Now, there are many aspects of the Cold War. The Cold War really first manifested itself in the division of Europe. At the end of World War II, American forces largely occupied the western half of Europe. Meanwhile, Soviet military forces occupied the eastern half of Europe. This was the result of the war. In defeating the Germans, the Soviets were essentially left in control of Eastern Europe, while the United States was left with great power in Western Europe. And there was a great question at the end of the war about the future of Europe. The United States, of course, wanted to promote liberal democracy and free market capitalism in Europe, whereas the Soviets, of course, wanted to promote communism and authoritarian dictatorships across Europe that would be allied with the Soviet Union. So hostility emerged very, very quickly and manifested itself in a variety of ways. One of the crucial crisis points was the situation in Berlin. Germany was split in two at the end of the Second World War, with the Americans, British, and French occupying the western half of Germany, and the Soviets occupying the eastern half of Germany. Meanwhile, the city of Berlin was also split in two at the end of the war, again with the Americans, British, and French occupying the western half of the city, and the Soviets dominating the eastern half of Berlin. There's tremendous disagreement about what should be done with Germany, and very early on it was clear that the two sides would not be able to be united. The United States was pursuing a policy of establishing a democratic form of government in West Germany, whereas the Soviets had imposed a brutal authoritarian dictatorship in Eastern Germany. And there was really very little room for compromise on this issue. How do you compromise between democracy and dictatorship, or between a capitalist economy and a command economy? Ultimately, it was clear that two Germanys would be emerging: a West Germany, deeply under the influence of the United States, and East Germany, really dominated by communism and the Soviet Union. A flashpoint in this Cold War struggle was Berlin. Berlin was deep within Soviet-controlled East Germany, yet by the terms of the agreement that ended World War II, the United States and its British and French allies had control of the western part of the city. This was very infuriating to the Soviets and to Joseph Stalin, their leader, and Stalin and the Soviets decided to try to resolve this issue by blockading the western half of Berlin. In 1948, the Soviets announced that no supplies, no food, no fuel, no medical equipment or drugs would be allowed into the western half of Berlin until the people of Berlin agreed to surrender control of the city to the Soviets. So essentially the Soviet threat was this: you, the people of West Berlin, will starve to death and freeze to death unless you allow the Soviet Union to take control of your community. The United States had to decide how to respond to this threat. We couldn't just invade East Germany to get to West Berlin without provoking a third world war. The United States ultimately decided on a massive airlift of material. So ironically, just 3 years after World War II, when the United States had been bombing Berlin into oblivion, the United States was now, often with the same pilots, flying critical food, fuel, and supplies to keep West Berlin alive. Ultimately, this proved to be a media win or a propaganda win for the United States. The United States appeared to be the good guy, if you will, in this struggle. We're trying to feed people, the Soviets are trying to starve people. And as a result, the Soviets ultimately gave up this strategy of the blockade, and West Berlin would be a small island of capitalism and democracy within communist-controlled Eastern Europe throughout the Cold War, interestingly. That's just one of many examples of the growing struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union in the late 1940s, early 1950s. So you're asked to comment on how the Cold War began to emerge in the post-war period in the discussion board. Now, the film deals with the issue of propaganda. The film that you're asked to watch is roughly 45 minutes in length. It's a fairly recent production, and it's called In the Shadow of Fear: Love, Hate, and Propaganda. Propaganda would play a crucial role in the Cold War. The United States and the Soviet Union would both use propaganda to try to encourage their people, the public, to support this struggle. The United States would use propaganda, would use all of the assets of media, film, television, publications, to promote a vision of communism as evil, as a hated enemy. This propaganda machine began very soon after the end of World War II. Ironically, during World War II, the United States propaganda had promoted the Soviet Union as our friends. Joseph Stalin was referred to as Uncle Joe and given a friendly image in American propaganda during the war. which of course was radically untrue. He was a horribly brutal dictator. During the Cold War, the overwhelming message that was broadcast to Americans was to fear communism. And to understand why this was the case, I can point to the issue of the Truman Doctrine. Shortly after World War II, a crisis emerged in Greece. There is a very real threat that communists might seize control of Greece. Greece had a very unpopular government led by a monarchy, a king, and there was a large communist movement within Greece that was threatening to topple the government. A civil war had erupted in Greece. Harry Truman, the President of the United States, was determined not to allow Greece to fall to communism. He feared that if Greece became a communist nation aligned with the Soviet Union, that the Soviets would soon gain control of the entire Mediterranean Sea. So Truman needed, in pursuing this policy, to send hundreds of millions of dollars of aid, military aid primarily, to the Greek government to fight the communists. But how could he win approval for this from Congress? Why would the American people support giving what today would be tens of billions of dollars adjusted for inflation to a foreign country that Americans knew relatively little about? Republicans controlled Congress, and traditionally, Republicans had been isolationist. Many people don't realize this today, but traditionally the Republican Party was the party that opposed any intervention in foreign affairs, any involvement in foreign wars. This had been the dominant theme of the Republican Party for decades. And there was every reason to believe that the Republicans might oppose sending money to help the Greek monarchy. Truman approached the Republicans in Congress on this issue, and the leadership of the Republican Party commented quite bluntly that if Truman wanted them to support sending huge amounts of aid to Greece, that Truman would have to convince the American public that the Soviets were a serious threat, that Truman would have to instill fear in the American public. Reportedly, one political leader commented, if Truman wanted to win the American public's support for providing aid to Greece, he would have to, quote, scare the hell out of the American people. And a massive campaign of propaganda was launched to compare Stalin to Hitler, to say that the Soviets are the new Nazis, they are the new threat to the world, and just as we had to confront the Nazis and Hitler during World War II, we have to confront Stalin and the Soviets in this era. Ultimately, support for the sending of aid to Greece was overwhelming in Congress, and this began a long global war. We are all familiar now with the concept of the global war on terrorism. The first global war that America really embraced, a decades-long struggle, was the global war on communism. The Truman Doctrine was a statement that the United States would fight the emergence of communism everywhere on Earth. Anywhere in the world where communism emerged, the United States would intervene to crush it, to stop its spread, whether it be in the jungles of Southeast Asia, in the deserts of North Africa, or whether it be in Latin America. The United States would fight a globally expansive war against communism. Now, so the film will address this issue of propaganda. And of course, the Soviets also used very propaganda methods as well to influence their public. The focus essay that you're commenting on this week is entitled America Enters the Middle East. And given current events, I think you'll find it to be rather interesting. It talks about how America began to emerge as the most important power in the Middle East after World War II. For 2 decades prior to World War II, the British and French had really been the dominant powers in the Middle East. At the end of World War I, the Ottoman Empire, which was centered in Turkey, collapsed. And the British and French, being the victors of the First World War, each took over a part of the Middle East, the former Ottoman Empire. The British essentially took control of Palestine, as it was referred to at the time, and Iraq. Meanwhile, the French government took control largely of Syria. And the French and British would essentially administer and control the Middle East as colonial powers from the end of World War I in 1918 up through the Second World War, essentially. However, at the end of World War II, Britain and France were both devastated. Both of their countries were severely weakened by the war. It was pretty clear that they could no longer dominate the Middle East. And very soon after the war, the United States began to emerge as the dominant force in the Middle East. The first real crisis to emerge in the Middle East after World War II was the situation in the British Mandate of Palestine. Again, for decades, the British had been in control of Palestine. After World War II, millions of Jews in Europe began to migrate to Palestine. The Jewish population of Europe had suffered incredibly during World War II. Jews had been displaced from their homes, and roughly half of the Jewish population of Europe had been killed in the Holocaust, approximately 6 million people. Most Jews had no place to go. If you survived the Holocaust, you could not simply return to your hometown. If your home community was in Poland, it probably literally didn't exist anymore. Jewish communities were entirely wiped out. And even if your home did exist, it was likely taken over. When the Jewish population was sent to the ghettos and then sent to the concentration camps, other people moved into their homes and took possession of them, and would not be welcoming of the return of the Jewish population. Most Jews wanted to leave Europe, given the horrors that had happened during the war. And in searching for a place to go, Palestine seemed to be a likely destination. Of course, Palestine was the historical homeland of the Jewish people prior to the diaspora in the 2nd century of the Common Era, and there already was a sizable Jewish community residing in Palestine. For many decades, dating back into the 1800s, in fact, there had been a movement, it was referred to as Zionism, a movement of Jews seeking to resettle in Palestine, essentially. So there already was a pre-existing Jewish community there. So as thousands of Jews began to move to Palestine, tension began to flare up between the Jewish settlers and the Palestinian Arab population. The British struggled to control this conflict, and ultimately the British decided they could no longer manage this crisis, given their weakened state. They turned over the Mandate of Palestine to the United Nations, an international agency, and the United Nations decided that the best resolution to this problem would be to divide Palestine into one Jewish territory and into another Arab territory, Palestinian territory, so that two separate territories would be created. In 1948, the leadership of the Jewish state decided to declare their independence in the formation of a separate nation, the State of Israel. And there was great debate in the United States whether to recognize the State of Israel. George Marshall, the Secretary of State, didn't want to recognize the State of Israel. George Marshall, the chief diplomat of the United States, argued to Harry Truman, the president, that recognizing the State of Israel would create tremendous hostility within the Arab world, and that it would be a serious problem for the United States going forward. Harry Truman rejected this advice and chose to recognize the State of Israel and to provide Israel with massive amounts of aid and support. There were a few reasons for this. One were political considerations. Harry Truman's political advisors told him that supporting the State of Israel would be politically beneficial for his re-election. Also, Truman believed that Israel could be an important ally in the Middle East in the Cold War, and he feared that the Soviets might become the chief ally of Israel if the United States did not. So that's discussed in the essay that you're reading for this week. Another issue that's discussed is the situation that emerged in Iran and a situation that emerged over the Suez Canal in Egypt. In both situations, the British had previously dominated these regions. The British had dominated Iran for decades through their control of the oil industry, and the British had dominated Egypt through their control of the Suez Canal for decades. In the post-war world, though, the British would have very limited power, and they had to rely on cooperation with the United States to influence world events. The United States, under the leadership of President Eisenhower, would work with the British to ensure that the West would retain control over Iranian oil. Ultimately, the British and the United States would work, Britain and the United States would work together to topple the government of Iran and to install a pro-Western, pro-American government in Iran as part of this global struggle of the Cold War. In Egypt, there would be disagreement between the United States and Britain, and the United States would ultimately block a British effort to topple the government of Egypt. I think you'll find the article to be very interesting. I'll be interested to read your comments about it. I look forward to working with you during this unit. Thank you.